It's my real duty and pleasure this afternoon to introduce our speaker, Martin Roesch, who founded Sourcefire in 2001 and serves as its Chief Technology Officer. He has 20 years of industry experience in network security and embedded systems engineering. He's an authority on intrusion prevention and detection technology. He's the author and lead developer of the Snort intrusion prevention and detection system that forms the foundation for the Sourcefire system. Martin's career has been dedicated to developing intelligent network security tools and technologies to address evolving threats. He has applied his knowledge of network security, threat analysis, and forensics for numerous government and multinational customers. He's been widely interviewed and cited as an industry expert and has received a host of awards for his technology innovation and vision. In 2006, he was named as one of Information Week's 18 innovators and influencers, and one of the Tech Council of Maryland's most influential CTOs. Martin was also the recipient of the 2004 InfoWorld IT Heroes Innovator Award, as well as winning the 2004 40 Under 40 Award from the Baltimore Business Journal. I had a chance to meet him a moment ago, and I think he's still eligible for that 40 Under 40 by age. Most recently, he was recognized as a 2010 Security Superstar by CRN Magazine and was selected as one of the eWeek's top 100 most influential people in IT. So we are truly privileged to have Martin Roesch with us today, and I ask you to welcome him for his presentation. Martin?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming to join us, in talking about, we got a little early start on my preso here, talking about intrusion detection and network security perspectives from a veteran. And I'm not a veteran of wars or anything like that. I'm a veteran of this industry. I'm a guy who's been in this industry for quite a while, and despite my youthful good looks, I am as jaded as any person in this industry. Because I've seen a lot of things over the past really 15 to 20 years that I've been involved with it. And I'd like to share some of the insights that I've had as a member of this industry, as a guy who creates technology, as a guy who's created a security company that's been somewhat successful, and as a guy who's still trying to come up with better ways to solve this problem. Because this problem, I don't think any of us would think that the internet security problem is anywhere near solved these days. So, if we're going to talk about this, it's interesting. My father was a history teacher, a high school history teacher, and I've always been fascinated by history. So I always like to look at the history of things that I'm involved with to understand why we are where we are today, and kind of gives me insights to be able to predict where we're going to go in the future. So let's talk about the past of information security, and we'll talk about my past a little bit too. Lost in the mists of time here, the archaeological dig that is the internet security industry. So let's just talk about my past a little bit. So I got started in network security in 1996 as a government contractor. That's a picture of me back in 2000. My hair is nice and brown, not gray like it is now, and things like that, right? And it's really interesting. If you look at the industry back then, we had a lot of really interesting things going on. Intrusion detection systems were very hot back then. We had vulnerability management. Firewalls were still a major technology like they are today, but they were one of the core technologies that people were buying. I got started as a government contractor. I ended up up the road with our friends at Fort Meade, working on some pretty interesting technologies and really diving into network security. Prior to that, I'd been an embedded systems engineer. I'm a coder. I'm a guy. My background is computer engineering, so developing digital systems, writing software for them, and things like that. And I got involved in network security projects, and I thought it was fascinating. And I thought it was fascinating for a few reasons. It was a new field, relatively new field. There was a lot of things going on there. It was hard to wrap your brain around everything that was going on, but it was a field in which there was constant research and major breakthroughs happening constantly, new techniques of exploitation, new attack techniques, things like that. We were all still kind of learning the ins and outs of the internet and things like that. So I was very, very interested in it, and I decided to dedicate myself to working in information security, or cybersecurity as we've come to call it, back in those days. So one of the ways that I learned how to be a security guy was being the coder that I am. I like to sit down and look at how other people had developed security tools, scanners, firewalls, honeypots, sniffers, and intrusion detection systems. And one of the ways that I would learn how they work was I would write one. So I wrote scanners and honeypots and firewalls and intrusion detection systems until eventually in 1998, late in the year, I sat down and I wrote a little sniffer that I came to call Snort. And Snort is really a great microcosm of how a lot of technologies that we've come to rely on come to be. So let's talk about Snort a little bit. So the early days of Snort, how did Snort start? Snort was written in a weekend by me in late 1998. And it was not what it is today, whatever 300,000 or 400,000 lines of code that it is today, and all the different elements that make up Snort. It was a tiny little sniffer, about 1,200 lines of code, fueled by caffeine and an interest to dig into the ins and outs of network traffic analysis. So I wrote Snort in a spare bedroom in my house. This is back before I had kids, when I did have spare bedrooms. And in the first year that I worked on it, I did 23 releases of the code. So I went from version 0.96, which was my first release. I figured it would take me about 4 releases till I could get to 1.0, which was kind of funny, if you consider how long it actually did take to get to 1.0. And I read the open source manifesto of the time, the Cathedral and the Bazaar, which said one of its prime tenets was release early, release often. So I released a lot of code, 23 releases in a year, right? Basically every couple of weeks I would crank out a new version of Snort. I also did one of the things that the Cathedral and the Bazaar recommended, which was to over-communicate with my community. I built my community by talking to everybody in my community, literally. I would sit down at night, and the guys on the mailing list in the early days used to joke about it. They could tell when I was done coding for the night, because I'd sit there and answer 20 or 30 emails at a stretch and flood the mailing list with responses. And the interesting thing about Snort, and I think it's interesting about a lot of technologies, the foundation of what Snort is today was really developed in the first year that was out there. I went from 0.96 to version 1.5 in the first year. In version 1.5, the basic architecture that was in 1.5 is still the basic architecture we're using today. The detection engine mechanisms, the rules language, the concept of having preprocessors that can normalize data and do all sorts of different analysis, the output plugin system. This is all kind of cemented in the first year, and we're still into this model of running Snort. And you can see the original logo for Snort up there on the top and what it's turned into down on the bottom here. It's a little more corporate now. Now that I have a corporation, I figured having a picture of a muddy pig as my open source project mascot probably wasn't the best idea when I went to corporate America to try to sell it. So that's my little story about how Snort came to be. But you know, the interesting thing about most of your security technologies is if you look at them, look at where they came from. I mean, really look at where they came from. Who are the first people who developed the security technologies we all rely on? Look at things like firewalls. Marcus Rainham working on DexSeal and some of the team there. Gil Shwed working on what turned into the Checkpoint firewall when he was in the Israeli military. Look at where these things came from. Dan Farmer and VC Venema, the original Satan scanner, one of the first vulnerability scanners. It's a very few people who create the foundational technologies that we all rely on. And the interesting thing about it is that it's really a vanishingly small number of people who have created the technologies that we all rely on today. And the conditions in which they have done it are pretty interesting as well. Because the conditions in which they've done it frequently are guys working in their spare time, right? I wrote Snort in my spare time. I had a day job. And then at night, I went home, and after, I had dinner with my wife, and, she went to bed, I'd stay up all night writing Snort. And then I'd go do my day job again the next morning. I bet that's not an uncommon story. I bet you that happened a lot with things like vulnerability scanners, firewalls, intrusion detection systems, honeypots, guys working in their spare time who then parlay these ideas into the things that they've become today. Now, originally when I wrote this slide, I said it probably wouldn't fill a 737, not a 777, but I think a 777, given how far down the road we are today, is probably a little more believable. The number of people that have written these technologies is maybe a couple of hundred. And they keep creating technologies. They come up with new stuff, and they get it out there. But the interesting thing about it is that usually when people are creating these things, a lot of times the environments that they're creating them in maybe aren't as receptive as they could be to the development that they're doing. So I'll give you a good example. So I wrote a Honeypot back in the the mid to late 90s, just before I wrote Snort. I wrote this Honeypot system for my day job, and it was a really cool technology. I really liked what it could do. This was back in the days before HoneyD and tools like that, where HoneyD lets you set up a virtual network and do all sorts of cool things with it. I did the same thing using a single Spark. It could mimic an entire Class C network. You could load post-definition files in it. People would come and go. So if you tried to finger users on the network, they would pop up, and sometimes they'd be there, and sometimes they weren't, based on the shifts that you gave them. All sorts of cool stuff like that. So it was a cool technology. We had it with a government customer, and the government customer really liked it. So one day, I got done coding, and I walked down the hall to this guy who'd been with the company for a really long time. I said, this technology is cool. We should build a product, a commercial product around this technology, and get it out the door. And he said, do you have any idea how hard it is to develop a commercial product? And I was 27 at the time, so I said, no, but other companies do it, right? This isn't an insurmountable problem, is it? And he said, well, we're not set up to do that. And that was kind of, we had an argument for about a half hour, and then I threw up my hands and walked away. A few months later, I wrote what turned into Snort. So it's really interesting, because a lot of times, due to the way that these technologies grow up, we get locked into all sorts of interesting things. There's an inertia that comes with a lot of these systems. And some of these early decisions that we make, maybe when we're tired, maybe when we're disgruntled, maybe when we're just trying to get it out the door, can really affect things down the road. So let's have an example of that. I'll cite two examples. So I found out I was doing this talk several weeks ago, and that was great. And I thought, wow, this would be really fun to do a talk on this stuff because it's a fun topic. And then I found out that the guy who was going to go before me was Vint Cerf. And I said, oh, that's great, the father of the internet. And then the guy wrote Snort. Perfect. But I watched Vince talk last night. Just wanted to refresh myself to see what he had covered and things like that. And there was one part of his talk that was just hilarious. He was talking about why IPv4 has 32-bit addresses. It was hilarious to me as a software developer. So the right way to have done IPv4, and they even knew it at the time, was to either have something like 128-bit addresses or have variable length addresses. And 128-bit addresses was hard to explain to people, especially if we're talking 1974 technology here. I'm going to need to do a lot of work, use up a lot of compute cycles to look at these addresses and calculate them and things like that. And he said, this is just a prototype. 32 bits will be fine. We can live with 32 bits for the prototype, and and then we'll fix it later. So here we are 40 years later, and it's still that way. These systems have inertia. Snort's the same way. The Snort rules language that we all use and rely on, that almost every intrusion detection and prevention project or product uses these days, was designed by me in a half hour on a whiteboard in my spare bedroom of my house at about 2 o'clock in the morning, when I was pretty tired. And its number one feature was that I could add stuff to it later, because at the time I knew that I didn't know enough to design this language properly. So I came up with a system that is what we are still using today. Some of the data structures that are in Snort are the same way. We have an inertia in these systems, and they stick with us for a long time. 13 years later on the Snort project, we're still living with some of that inertia. So it's really fascinating how these things come to be. Tired guys working in their spare time for management that doesn't understand the cool technology that they're working on and why it has commercial potential. And usually what happens next is the startup. And startups are risky things, right? If you never try anything new, you'll miss out on many of life's great disappointments. Startups are designed to fail, and in fact, most of them do fail. The odds of a startup going from business plan to successful IPO'd startup like Sourcefire, some of our venture capitalists have the data on that. It's about 1 in 50,000 from business plan coming in their door, to IPO, 1 in 50,000. Which is great odds for the entrepreneur, actually. Look at the Powerball odds, right? Powerball odds are about 1 in 80 million. So if you're an entrepreneur and you can get that far, you're doing pretty good. You can get to business plan, you got a 1 in 50,000 shot at having an outcome that's probably going to be pretty good for you. So for you, pretty good odds. The VC, not so great, which is why VCs, despite seeing about 1,000 business plans a month, usually fund somewhere between 4 and 8 companies a year. So we do startups because we have good ideas and nobody understands them. And we try to build successful companies around these ideas. And really interesting things happen as a result of that. So my startup was to take Snort, which was this thing that I knew people liked, and turn it into something that I think that people would be willing to pay for. I had a problem. It wasn't to build a really good intrusion detection system. I'd already built that. My problem was getting people to pay for something that was free, which is actually kind of a hard problem. So we went out there and we started Sourcefire, and I had no money at all. Credit cards, whatever I had in my bank account, I got a personal loan from a friend of mine for some equity in the company, and I got Sourcefire rolling. So what did Sourcefire look like in the first year of its operation? Looked like that. You can't see it very well, but that was the living room of my house, where Sourcefire was located in 2001, and those are the guys, that was the staff of Sourcefire at the time. I'll show you our lab. That's our lab. So that's what we call the Defense Center today, and those are some sensors and build systems, and that end table they're sitting on is from Walmart. You don't need a lot to get going with a software startup. You don't need a lot to get going with a web startup. You need a good idea, you need a business plan that's actually possible to turn into money, and you need to work your butt off until you get somewhere with it. Here, I'll show you one more picture. This is hard to see. So that guy right there runs my maintenance engineering team now, and that stack of boxes over there with a cat on top of it is our first order, about to go out to our first customer who actually thought our ideas were good enough to pay us money and get us going. And then from there, Sourcefire got funded. Miraculously enough, the VCs, the venture capitalists, started taking our calls. Right? And venture capitalists are great guys, right? All they ask is that you give them your heart. So venture capitalists were very interested. Once we were actually got to the point where we proved we could make money, they were very, very interested in talking to us about giving us some money in exchange for some equity, and we'll see if we can turn this into a going concern. My company happened to be one of the 1 in 50,000, my business plan, that actually worked out. So it's really fascinating. And this is how a lot of these companies start. If you look at the early guys, from Marcus Random and Gil Schwed to Dan Farmer and VC Venema, these guys who took these ideas, spun them out into startups, and then went and got venture capital and turned them into the industry that we have today. And venture capital is a really interesting thing. Venture capital shapes the technologies you get to use. It really does. Because if you go into a venture capitalist with an idea that nobody's asking for, that nobody knows what it is or does, you're going to have a very hard time convincing a guy to give you $5, $10, $20 million to turn that into a business. And it's really kind of fascinating. We had a technology that we developed in 2003 that was exactly that. It was a technology that was a great helper technology for security software. It would passively map a network by watching the network, passively map it, you could feed that information into IDSs or whatever, and tell them what the networks were and how they were changing and things like that. And when we built it, nobody was asking for that, nobody knew what it did, and if we had tried to go out and build a company and raise VC on that, probably would have gotten absolutely nowhere. Because the venture capitalists would have said, where's your market? Well, we don't know where our market is. Well, who are your proof customers? Nobody knows they want this yet. Well, we built the technology anyway, and it turned out to be a big hit. But really, if you think about your security technologies, where they come from, that's how they come to be. So this has shaped a lot of things. And the present that we're in today is shaped by things that happened 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Single guys sitting down, cranking out code on a project that they believed in, or an idea that they had, and then turning that into something big. I love the talks about how the early public key crypto systems came to be. A lot of them were formed over late night wine and whatever else in hot tubs in California and things like that. Guys hanging out, thinking up great ideas and turning them into RSA. It's really interesting. So let's talk about the present a little bit. So the present's really interesting right now because things are so crazy right now. We have a lot of challenges out there, don't we? Right? We have the cloud, we have virtual computing, we have endpoints that are consumerized and mobile and things like that. I like to talk about, when I'm doing other presentations, I like to talk about What is computing like now versus where it was 10 and 15 years ago? 10 and 15 years ago, what was our computing environment like? Back when I started Sourcefire, my laptop was my occasional machine. I'd use it when I was out on the road, and I'd come back and I'd plug it in, and I would let it do its thing. You know, it'd synchronize with my desktop. And day to day, my desktop was my primary machine. You know, what's it like today? Well, it's probably a lot like, you know, this for you guys too. Here's my occasional machine, right? Anybody have one of these, smartphone? I'm sure probably all of you have one of these, especially if you're in computer science or cybersecurity or anything like that. People use these things and they're real live computers. This actually has more horsepower than the computer I wrote Snort on. It actually has quite a bit more. More memory, more RAM, better connectivity. This thing has a 3G modem in it that I would have killed for if there had been 3G networks back in 1998. So, and this is my day-to-day, or my power machine. This is a machine that I use every day, and I carry with me everywhere I go. It is a consumerized and mobile endpoint. This consumerization of IT that we hear all about constantly. It is people saying, I like this Mac that I can buy at Best Buy better than that Dell that you spec'd out 3 years ago that is the corporate standard. Can I use this thing? Because I can be really productive with it. And management going like this, and IT going like this. But that's how it goes. People don't want to be told they can't be productive. People want to be told they can go do their jobs and get them done in the way that they want to. That's what leads to a happy workforce. That's what leads to a productive workforce. So the consumerization and mobilization of the endpoints, these things going on the road, this has significant security challenges. Back when my desktop machine was my primary machine and it sat in a room and it was plugged into a wall on a network, and if the power went away or you unplugged the cables, the thing stopped communicating to my network. That was a pretty easy environment to defend. But you know, if you look at the security technologies that came out of that era, we're still using a lot of them, and they still try to pretend that that's the way that networks exist. We have virtualization now, which asks us all sorts of annoying questions like, how do I secure a network that changes minute to minute? We have technologies like vMotion and VMware where I can move a data center literally from coast to coast over the course of minutes or hours. That's a problem if I'm securing that environment because my security configuration needs to migrate with it. And usually security is the last thing that the guys who run the apps that are moving from point A to point B are concerned about. Their job is to keep those apps up and running. Security is the network team's problem. Security is the security team's problem. It's not the apps team's problem. And then the cloud. Where's my data? Who secures it? This is actually interesting. I talked to a VP of engineering at a major software company a few months ago, several months ago, I guess now, and they've got a big cloud initiative, and it was good catching up with him on the phone. And he asked me, Marty, what do you think about where the line of demarcation is between where a cloud provider's responsibility for security ends and the end user's security begins? And this guy runs the engineering team for this company. I was like, well, don't you know? Because it seems like a question you guys should have figured out by now. He's like, well, just tell me what your opinion is. Oh, great. And I said, well, look, when it's in the cloud, obviously it's your problem to secure it. When it's in transit, you've got to provide secure connectivity from point A to point B. And once it's in the user's premise, then it's their problem. I would say that's where the line of demarcation is. But that's not a decided question. From cloud provider to cloud provider, that's not a decided question at all. In fact, we come to find out things like Dropbox. Hey, Dropbox encrypts all your data. Oh, and by the way, we own the private keys too, and we can give it to law enforcement agencies, the government, whoever can get us to turn over the data to them. Is that a problem for anybody? Yeah, if you care about security, confidentiality, privacy, things like that, it definitely is. Especially if you're a dissident in a country that doesn't support whatever cause you're supporting, and you've been using Dropbox to store your data. That's a big problem. And you know, this is the easy side of the problem. This is the stuff that we can wrap our hands around. We can actually pick up the phone and talk to these people and have reasonable conversations with them. What about the other side of the coin, the threats? What are the threats like today out there? Are they powerful? They're pervasive? Yeah, they sure are. Now it's really interesting, this kind of environment that we have right now that's going on with hackers, or excuse me, advanced persistent threats, or wait a second, cyber criminals. Right? We have lots of names for this guy, but this guy is out there, and he's interested in a lot of different things. If he works for the Russian mob, he's interested in getting your credit card data or getting your PII databases that you might have. If he works for Anonymous, maybe he's interested in embarrassing you. Maybe he's interested in making you look very stupid, taking down your company, right? You go in a security company and Anonymous decides to go after it, oh boy, that's probably going to be a pretty rough couple of weeks, right? We saw that happen recently. Script kiddies. We used to call these guys script kiddies back in the day. I don't think too many people are laughing about script kiddies these days. If you look at the most recent data breach investigations report that came out from Verizon, which is something that, if you're in cybersecurity, is something that you should read every year. The data breach investigations report coming out is like Christmas for security people. It should be, in my opinion, because it has something that is sorely lacking in this world. It has hard data on what actually happened. And not just a little bit of hard data, but a lot of hard data. You know, we looked at 100 cases across the globe over the past year, and here's what we saw, and here are the trends. The difficulty of most of the attacks that were executed against the people that the Verizon data breach team helped out last year were not of high complexity. In fact, I think the vast majority, I forget what the stats are right now, but the vast majority were of medium to low complexity. So that's not great. So why are these guys doing that? Is there any particular reason why they're doing that? Well, you know, filthy lucre, right? There's a lot of money to be made right now doing this stuff. If you live in a part of the world that has limited economic opportunity and a cyber cafe, if you've got the brains to get hooked up into, you know, the global hacking community, you can be elevated in your economic bracket very, very quickly. Very quickly. It doesn't take a lot. Do you know what the street value of a weaponized exploit is these days? It can be as much as about $100,000 US for one weaponized exploit. So say you live in a village in Eastern Europe someplace where the average annual income is somewhere south of $20,000 US a year, and you have the gift of being able to hack. And you have the gift not only of being able to hack, but you also have all the tools to do it. Right? You can get them for free on the internet if you know where to look, or almost for free, or crack the keys off and whatever. You get the right tools. If you've got the smarts, you can start doing things like reversing Adobe Acrobat, getting into Microsoft Internet Explorer, getting into Microsoft Office document formats, things like that. Look for exploits, and then you can sell them. We had an exploit that we discovered in Adobe Acrobat 2 years ago now. So it was a zero-day attack. It was weaponized. It was put out there in the market. We helped spread the alarm about it. And then I came to find out later, several months later, that somehow we found out how much the guy who discovered that exploit got paid for it. He got paid about $75,000 for that exploit in 2009. That's pretty good money, right? Why wouldn't you hack? What are your risks if you're an Eastern European or Chinese hacker going after US-developed software? Is there big extradition treaties? Is the DEA, the RIAA, or the MPAA going to show up at your door and kick it in and drag you off to America? No, I don't think so. Right? You have very little risk if you're a hacker, especially overseas. There's a good story I like to tell that I heard Nils Gilman give. He's kind of a big thinker, futurist. He has a presentation. If you go search on his name on Google, it'll pop up a video link to this talk he gave at the 4th European Futurist Conference a couple of years ago. And he talked about the case of hackers in Brazil. So you had these Brazilian hackers who were kind of informally just doing their thing. They were busting into the next town over's soccer team website and spray painting them, saying you stink and stuff like that. And eventually somebody in Brazil said, this has got to stop. And they cracked down on these guys. And very rapidly, we separated the men from the boys, the wheat from the chaff. We got rid of all the guys who really weren't very good, and the guys who were left really were good. And all of a sudden there was risk involved in their activities. So risk also denotes reward. Take risks, you get reward, right? So after not too long, these guys became so good at their jobs of busting into websites or busting into sites and then doing whatever they wanted to do that they were being hired out by the Russian mafia to go break into banks. Right? We applied pressure to this ecological system that had previously been fallow. We selected for good hackers, and what happens? World-class hackers. And Nils has this great conclusion that he points out. Once a deviant industry is professionalized, crackdowns merely promote innovation. I love this because it's exactly right. We look at things like what we've come to call the persistent threat, the advanced persistent threat, or hackers, or cyber criminals, or whatever. We look at that now. That's exactly what we've seen. We've come up with regimes of prosecution. And oh, by the way, we also put a lot of really valuable data online. And these guys have established markets for this data. They've established markets for the weapons required to get this data. They've established a value for ownership of real estate, essentially, botnets and things like that. They've established all these things. They've innovated. In fact, they're incredibly innovative. If you look at the Data Breach Investigations report, you'll find out a year ago the primary vector for busting into networks was going after email. Now it's in-person contact. In 1 year, they transitioned from going after you via email to now calling you up on the phone because they've got all this data on you, right? You go to pipple.com and things like that. You can look up all sorts of information on people and get it out of there. To the point now where the size of the hacking industry is getting pretty daunting. You know how big the hacking industry is in terms of, quote-unquote revenue that they're generating per year? I've seen data that I find believable. It's somewhere between probably $10 and $100 billion a year. Do you know what the size of the cybersecurity industry is? It's about $20 to $25 billion a year. So if you're conservative with the data, the numbers, the money that the bad guys are making, they're making about as much as we are. And they don't have anything like the overhead we've got. They don't have HR, they don't have legal, they don't have finance and accounting, they don't have the healthcare fair every year, they don't have any of this stuff. They got R&D, they got operations, and that's it. So it's really interesting. So in the face of that, what have we deployed? What have we developed? Modern defenses, right? We've got a host of modern defenses out there to compensate for this activity. But most of the modern defenses that we put out there, in large part, were developed, maybe the really modern cutting-edge stuff developed 5 years ago. But almost nobody's using the stuff that was developed 5 years ago unless it's really caught the public's imagination because, quite frankly, it's too new to be trusted. So a lot of the technologies we're using are developed 10, 15, 20 years ago. Firewalls are a great example. They were developed and perfected really in probably about the first 5 to 8 years of their existence, and they've featured up since then. Intrusion detection systems are another good example of this. Intrusion detection systems were first imagined in the late 80s. They were first implemented in the early 90s to mid 90s. Snort came out in kind of the late 90s. And then, now we have this kind of system that's slowly evolving and featuring up and things like that. Now we have newer technologies like next generation firewalls and all these kinds of things that are kind of interesting. But really, if you look at the technologies that are out there, they all have a lot of built-in assumptions about how you do your job or how they're going to do their job. They expect you to know stuff about what you're protecting. And this is a real insight that I've had into the industry. Almost all of our technologies expect you to know a couple of fundamental things about what you're protecting, right? They expect you to actually know what you're protecting, which is a tremendous mistake. If you knew what you were protecting, you might have a prayer of actually protecting it. But the fact of the matter is that when this is your computer, and I can jump from network to network to network, minute to minute, literally, you don't really know what's on your network in a lot of cases, especially if you use classic technologies for figuring out what you've got on your network, like scanners and things like that. And then the flip side of that one, of course, is the threats that you face. If you knew what you're protecting, you could potentially, conceptually, possibly enumerate the things that you face. But since you don't actually know what you're protecting, since I have an intrusion detection system that's been subjected to my configuration control directives, which let me update its signature definitions when the maintenance windows open at 2 o'clock in the morning on Thursdays, that thing has no prayer of being configured properly for your day-to-day, hour-to-hour, minute-to-minute network. It's going to have kind of broad generalizations of, hey, we shouldn't let this sort of thing in the network, and that might be bad. But there's going to be all sorts of things that are turned off that shouldn't be turned off, and some things turned on that probably shouldn't be turned on. And quite frankly, if you don't know what you're protecting, and you don't, then you can't possibly know the threats that you face. Well, how good does our software, our security technology work if it's misconfigured? The scanners, the firewalls, the IDSs and IPSs, the next-gen firewalls, all these technologies, how well do they work when they're misconfigured? Not very well. And then the onus goes back on the users of these systems to dig out the data that's meaningful versus the stuff that's garbage. And you have to sit there and become an expert in what these systems tell you and what might be good and what might not be good and things like that. And the industry really isn't helping you in a lot of cases because the de facto standard security technology that you buy from a vendor looks kind of like that. It's got a plug that goes in the wall, it's a big black box, and it says no user serviceable parts contained within. And this is a huge problem for me, and it's always been a huge problem for me because obviously I'm an open source guy. I build open source systems, and when I was writing Snort, Snort was like, hey, I'm going to put this new feature in Snort, and here's a switch to turn it on or turn it off, and here's a bunch of switches to tune it, configure it, and obviously this is the right way to do it. And then I started a company, and I had to start looking at my competitors' products, and it was like, so I bought my competitors' products and put them in-house and set them up and installed them and then started using them, and it was like, it's like putting on a set of blinders, because they didn't let you see how they were doing their job. They didn't let you know what they were looking for or how they were looking for it. They didn't give you the dials to tweak and tune them and do all sorts of interesting things with them and get them to look for things that they weren't necessarily designed or spec'd to look for. I found it infuriating. How could you possibly, why would you pay for this thing? You have no idea why it's giving you this bad data. You have limited ability to tune it, and you certainly have almost no ability to add the ability to look for things that you think are interesting. I always used to tell people, don't download Snort and turn it on and tell it to look for things that I think are interesting. Don't run the default rule set, whatever you do. Write rules for your environment. And that idea was terrible. That was a terrible idea because nobody wanted to do that. That actually required people to sit down and learn the systems and understand them and then build up a rule set for their environment and things like that. Only the most dedicated people did it. Only the top 5 to 10% of people did it. And the other people ran the rules that the community generated, that individuals generated, the test rules that I wrote, and things like that. So black box solutions really aren't adequate, and people really shouldn't run their security technologies. This is another kind of a revelation that I've had over the past 15 years, is that no matter how much flexibility you put in the technologies, people would rather have a black box in most cases until something goes wrong or until they reach a level of expertise where they understand, they've kind of attained enlightenment. And I don't know how long you have to be in the security industry and how jaded you have to become to actually reach that level. But you have to get to the level where you're actually going to pay attention to and mold these technologies to work appropriately with your environment. So this is a big requirement of doing security right, in my opinion. This is my opinion. I don't like these kinds of solutions at all. I don't think these kinds of solutions work very effectively. You rely on the vendor to keep your technology up to date all the time and pick smart defaults for your environment and have a technology that maybe, if you're lucky, can learn about your environment. But the fact of the matter is they can't. Because almost none of them actually look for what your network is configured like. They have a default configuration and a few knobs and dials, and that's about it. And then we have one more expectation that's levied upon you, the poor user. You're actually expected to pay attention. You have to pay attention to these technologies to get them to work. We need a man in the loop every step of the way to make these technologies do their thing. And if you don't pay attention, what happens? Well, if you look at the data breach investigation report, it's really easy to see what happens. The average amount of time it takes an attacker to go from getting into your network to getting data of value out of your network is usually measured in hours. The amount of time that it takes to detect him is usually measured in months. If you're not paying attention, when you get popped, maybe the first way you're going to learn about it is when you show up in the papers. And that's how it goes. So is this a fair fight? No, not really. Right? This is kind of the security model that we've gotten into. We're the guys in the castle. Unfortunately, the bad guys there are the guys with the fighter jets. So we need security solutions that can actually respond effectively to a world that's like this. We need a fair fight. If we're going to have a fair fight, we need to start reimagining how our security technologies work. Our security technologies can work in these very dynamic environments, in these cloud-based environments, in these virtual environments, in these consumerized and mobile environments. If we don't do that, we're going to have a lot of problems. If we keep building castles, the bad guys are just going to build bigger and better fighter jets. We need to build either anti-aircraft systems or fighter jets ourselves. Right? We need to be as agile as they are in order to be able to at least stay up with them or get ahead of them. So let's talk about the future a little bit. So this is kind of an interesting part of the talk, because I always hate doing the crystal ball thing. Good Niels Bohr quote here: "Prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future." Right? He was a physicist, buddy of Einstein's. See him on the couch there with Einstein. It's really hard to predict the future. I remember, 2 years ago, roughly, about 18 months ago. At the end of every year, my phone starts ringing as a guy who has something to say in the internet security industry and is relatively well known, it's usually the magazines and things like that. They're saying, hey, can you gaze into your crystal ball and tell me, oh master, what is security going to be like in 2010? What's it going to be like in 2011? What are the big things that are going to happen in 2012? Well, generally speaking, I have no idea. I have the insight into the things that I'm interested in, that I think are interesting. But a lot of times, it's a total guess, right? It's darts. And in 2009, if you read the intelligentsia about what security was going to be like in 2010, it's going to be DLP and PCI and all these compliance regimes and things like that. And sure, those are all very important. And then we get into the first month of 2010, and what happens? Our sponsor, Google, ends up in the papers because they have a little problem with one of their host countries taking a real interest in their internal workings. And Intel and Adobe and all these other companies fall like dominoes to this new thing, this new excuse, whatever you want to call it, called the Advanced Persistent Threat. And that's all we talked about last year, the Advanced Persistent Threat, keeping my data safe. Do these compliance regimes help us? Would data leak prevention have helped us? In a lot of cases, no. So what are the predictions I can make about what the future of security is going to look like? Well, I have some bets. I have some relatively good bets. So first off, IPv6. So I was watching Vince Cerf's talk, and I watched him talking about IPv6 and how we really had to move that way. And he's right. We probably do have to move that way. IPv4 is a prototype. It's about 30 years past its prime at this point, and we've ridden on it for a long time. But we really need to start thinking about transitioning to IPv6. Well, certain things are going to break when we do that. One of the things that I absolutely know is not going to work very well once we transition to IPv6 is any technology that relies on network scanning to do its job, especially network discovery scanning. So think about this. So I was talking to one of my guys last night who works in my company, and he's a real smart guy, PhD, computer science kind of guy, and I was saying, scanners are going to break when we go to IPv6. And he's like, why is that going to happen? Well, imagine scanning a /64 with Nmap. How long is that going to take? Okay, we'll start this. Estimated time of completion is 5,000 years from now. That's not good. But we have lots of technologies that rely on scanning to do their job. Things like network admission control systems, which is fine because usually that's an interactive thing where the system will attempt to register with you. But a lot of times, if I have a /64, or say I've got a /48, so I've only got, I forget what the numbers are, but I've got tens of billions of systems that I would have to scan to find an individual host in my environment. What's that going to be like? Well, it's not going to work very well at all. So he said, well, it really depends on what the assignment regimes look like and things like that. And I agreed with him, but I said, okay, but let's think about the number hogs, the guys who use a lot of data space on the internet, a lot of address space on the internet. Who's that? Well, are there any high-value targets? Let's see, big banks, big telcos, governments, militaries. Yeah, I'd say those are the guys who are going to be saying, yeah, I really need a /64 because I've got to put an IP address on every missile in the inventory from now until 500 years from now. So yeah, I'm going to need that /64, right? I've got 64 bits of 64-bit addresses to give out. That's not that much, really, in the grand scheme of things. But I can't scan that space anymore, so my scanning technologies are going to break. It'll be interesting to see things like state tables, how they fare against these, because we are still talking about human-scale deployment environments where we've got, I think Vince said something about 4.5 billion devices connected to the internet in one way or another right now. So maybe our state tables will hold up pretty well, but we're probably going to get to at least, well, hopefully 128-bit computers sometime in the near future so that we don't have to sit there and use our, I know, virtually free compute cycles, but it still takes a lot of pairs to do 128-bit addresses. But IPv6 is going to break things. So it'll be really interesting to see what that does to security technologies. Users and misconfiguration, this is a constant. This is almost a gimme. It's a good bet that users will continue to click on anything you email them. They will continue to surf to places that they shouldn't on the internet. It's a pretty safe bet that people are going to continue to misconfigure things. I think Vin was saying gross misconfiguration is one of the top security threats that we face. It's true. Absolutely true. Misconfigure the firewall. Oh, the #2 way of breaking into a network, according to the Data Breach Investigations report that just came out, was default passwords. There you go. That's the number 2, and that comes right after botnets, something that was pre-installed on your network by somebody who'd already broken in. So the number 1, I don't have access to your network already way to get into your network was default passwords. That's crazy. What year is it? Is it 1991 or is it 2011? If you are putting things with default passwords out on the network, that's nearly criminal negligence. How about trust? Is trust going to be an issue? I think so. Have we got any big trust issues going on right now? Well, the Dropbox one I just cited, that's a problem. I've got this cloud provider that's just fessed up to being backdoored by law enforcement and governments and things like that. Any other trust issues that we've seen recently? How about certificate authorities? Any trust issues there? Yeah, well, I got this one CA that's in the chain of trust of every other CA, virtually, and turns out they've got really weak coding and security practices inside their environment, and you can cut whatever kind of CAs you want to from them. Ooh, is that a problem? Yeah, the crypto infrastructure that SSL relies on, which all of e-commerce relies on, is rotten at the top, rotten at its very foundation, because it relies on trust chains, and these trust chains are only as good as the members that are within those trust chains. So can we continue to have these certificate authorities that are out there that basically anybody can join up with? It's like, yeah, I'm a trustworthy guy. I got an honest construction business in Russia, and I've decided I want to start cutting certificates for people. Is that a reasonable assumption? Well, there's 3 guys in Poland who trust me, and there's 2 guys in Germany who trust them, and so on and so forth. So that's a bit of a problem. And we've got a lot of things like public key infrastructures and SSL cert trust chains and things like that that rely on these sort of trust metrics. So who can we trust? Who can we trust as individuals? Who do you trust? Do you trust big banks? Everybody here feeling very trustworthy of big banks right now? They could be the head of a CA chain, right? Well, not if you've been paying attention since the end of 2008. Big banks don't really seem very trustworthy. How about big government? Big government. We can trust the government, right? They're here to help. That's not a very popular theme anymore either. So who do you trust? I've got all these technologies that rely on chains of trust. Does it come down to individual trust? You guys trust me. You have to trust me because I wrote the intrusion detection system that you all rely on that is installed everywhere in the world. So if you can't trust me, you're in deep trouble. Luckily, I'm a pretty nice guy. So that's not such a big problem. But these are serious things. We use tools developed by guys like me, who everybody trusts, to be developing on the up and up. And these things are audited and they're reviewed and things like that. There's third parties that say, yeah, you can trust this thing. And maybe it does come down to individual reputation as opposed to corporate reputation. Because really, we do see corporations act in very antisocial ways very frequently. And here's my last good bet. Big data. I think big data is one of these fields of internet security that is very early on in its development, but is going to be incredibly important. Google's doing really interesting things with big data, obviously. They can see all sorts of interesting things on the internet. They can crawl web pages and detect malware and then catalog it and do all sorts of interesting analysis on it. My company just bought a company that sought to redefine how antivirus worked by doing internet scale data mining on installed software across its entire deployed user base. So they've got on the order of about 1.2 million users right now, and they can see when one user executes a piece of software that's never been executed on any other desktop. How often do you think that happens? Actually, 75% of the detection that thing makes is software that's been seen exactly once across 1.2 million users. What is that one piece of software? Well, maybe that guy's a developer, probably not, or, because this is consumer software, or it's probably polymorphic malware or zero-day, something that hasn't been seen before. I've got over 1 million users running this piece of software, or this agent software, and communicating what's going on up to my cloud service, and I can see I have visibility across all 1.2 million desktops, what they've executed and things like that, and I can say, hey, here's something new, and I've never seen it before. Let's get that and take a look at it, take it apart, and see what it is. Big data, internet scale data mining, being able to do security, not looking at every endpoint as a castle unto itself, but looking at them as a collective of endpoints that have common interests of security, common interests of trust, common interests of configuration, perhaps. Being able to look at the data across those large data sets is very important to us these days. And I think that that's one of the places that we're going to see a lot of really interesting, innovative work done over the next 10 years. Because we are hooking up so much to the internet. There's so much information out there. The things that can collect that information and do intelligent things with it are going to become incredibly important. That can tell us things about our network environments, tell us things about what we're trying to protect that we can't see any other way. So that's the end of my talk. And I'd like to thank everybody very much for spending some time with me today. And I guess we'll open the floor up for questions now. So thanks very much.
Are there questions? So you mentioned IPv6 and user misconfiguration. And so I see kind of a train wreck coming, or at least that's the sense. So IPv6, my understanding is it relies on a lot of auto configuration techniques. So
Yeah.
you don't have to poke in 128-bit addresses.
Yep.
And again, firewalls aren't, don't know how to handle this stuff. You got to allow ICMP through the firewalls. You break a lot of the inherent goodness of IPv6.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious your thoughts on that when when the big switch is finally switched on and we're really doing it.
Well, Vince Cerf was talking about this upcoming IPv6 day that's going to happen where everybody's going to start routing IPv6 for a day to see what happens. I'll be really interested to see, A, who actually does flip the switch, and B, what happens as a result of that. There are all sorts of things. And the problems that you get into with that, so the question was, when IPv6 comes online, speaking of misconfiguration, all the auto-config stuff that IPv6 does and firewalling infrastructures that don't know about letting that through, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to be very unpredictable what happens because you do have all this self-configuration going on, which can potentially be subject to all sorts of interference. Who do the IPv6 endpoints trust to be able to get information, things like that. So yeah, those are definitely going to be issues when it happens, and they'll be kind of pounded out over years. But the real issue that you come into when you need to make a big transition like this is you're getting rid of 40 years of knowledge and best practices. We're not really getting rid of it, but you're switching to something where that knowledge and best practice set does not exist. And this is actually a problem that the entities like the government face. So the U.S. federal government runs on Microsoft Windows. Not wholly, but for a lot of its function, it does. And think about the progression. Windows XP came out. It was Swiss cheese, but it was well-known Swiss cheese, right? We understood where things were. We understood what the best practices for securing it were, and we had patch processes all laid out. And then Microsoft Vista comes along. We're going to end the life support on XP and encourage you all, because Microsoft's bottom line depends on you all moving to Vista. Encourage you all to go, and it's the most secure Windows ever. 35 million lines of new code. Come on, it's got to be secure, right? With a constant number of bugs introduced per line, per 100 lines of code, actually, it's the least secure Microsoft Windows has ever been developed. But on the other hand, they do have some nice controls put in place, right? They were trying, they were actively working on it. But we got rid of all the best practices, and Vista was not really a market, dynamo. So now we have Windows 7. And we're end-of-lifing Vista support, and everybody's encouraged to move to Windows 7. Well, all the best practices that we just came up with, we spent 3 years developing for Vista, now they're out the window, and we're up to Windows 7, and so on and so forth. So yeah, this best practices thing is actually a big issue, because you get rid of all this institutional knowledge that was effective, right? We pounded this into people's heads over years and years, and then you're back on the upgrade hamster wheel, right? And it's not going to be exactly the same with IPv6, but you are getting rid of decades of best practices and decades of knowledge into this new thing which operates somewhat differently. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I'm going to maybe be out on a sailboat the day that the switch is thrown, something not hooked up to the internet. Question?
So the bugs, the exploits that are in the software, right? People wrote that they exist, and people can do a better job or not such a good job of writing the software, so you have fewer exploits than you might otherwise. What it occurs to me is that the innovation culture that you talked about for the hackers does not exist for the people that write the software, because security is not a feature. If I get my product done in 18 months and my competitor got it done in 12 months, it's ruined with security bugs, they win and I lose. Mm-hmm. So how do we solve that problem?
Well, you just defined the difference between Internet Explorer and Netscape, really. And Netscape wasn't the most secure piece of software, I'll give you that, but they were trying to build what they thought was the right thing to build, and Microsoft said, oh my gosh, if we don't get on this and have the internet capability soon, came right down from Bill Gates from on high saying, we better have be internet aware, enabled everything as soon as possible. We've got to get out there and we've got to have more features than those guys. We got to kill them with features. We got to cut off their air supply, and that was exactly what they said. So they went out there, and did that cause any problems from a security standpoint? Oh yeah, it did. Sure it did. It launched 1,000 security careers. It really did. So Microsoft giveth, Microsoft taketh away. Microsoft gave us lots of features and a rich user experience and all these things, and the wonders of Internet Explorer, but it also took a lot of things, well, it didn't really take away, it also launched a lot of the internet security industry. So there was a lot of interesting economic activity around that. But yeah, this question of time to market concerns and how much do developers care about security, especially when they're under tight time deadlines and trying to get to market with a new technology or a competitive technology as a fast follower. How secure can they possibly be? If they don't have a culture of security built in from the beginning, or they don't have a lot of senior developers who've seen what happens when you don't write secure code, chances are that they're going to have train wrecks. And we see this over and over again. We see it happening right now, and it hasn't exactly been a train wreck, but we see it happening in the mobile software space with things like iOS and Android and the Windows Mobile and things like that, where we've got a lot of software being developed very quickly. We've got some secure execution environments, or relatively secure execution environments, where we've got walled gardens and things like that. But we already see, especially in the Android marketplace, which is a little bit more like the Wild West than some of the others, we see malware getting into those environments. So yeah, it's really pretty interesting because they are to some degree playing catch up with Apple, and Apple is executing mightily right now. If you looked at their last financial statements, it's jaw-dropping how well they're doing. So it's really interesting. When you see these kind of competitions break out in these major spaces, web browsers, mobile platforms, and things like that, the security ramifications of that. I saw that Apple was, I think it was Apple, was getting rid of Samba for their SMB DCRPC infrastructure and writing their own. And it was kind of funny. I was hanging out with my research team on our internal IRC channel. I was saying, crying tears of joy seeing Apple decide to implement their own protocols for this. Years of more productivity for us, guaranteed, right? When you see people do stuff like that, here's a tested open source code base that's been out there. For whatever reason, they decided they're going to go do their own, and they probably have solid engineering reasons for doing so. But the chances they're going to get it right the first time are zero. And the vulnerabilities that are going to result are going to be manna from heaven for 1,000 security companies that are out there that are really structured to find the bugs and do something about them, or at least let Apple know about them and provide you for protection while Apple is fixing their system, or Microsoft, or Google, or whoever. So yeah, it's really interesting. Question right here?
I have a comment and a question, and I need your feedback. I think this is the way I view it. Security and the legal system are in reactive mode, while the technologists are in a proactive mode. I don't know what you think about that. And my question is, the cloud usually right now is cloud computing. And the ecosystem environment is very cloudy. I mean, you see Google getting into Amazon's business, Amazon is getting into Google's business. You have all these newcomers coming and threatening the giants in the market, such as the Microsoft. Microsoft will be spending 90% of its research and development budget on cloud computing technology. When all the dust settles, whom do you see would be the leader of the pack?
Okay, so the question is, we have a lot of new entrants into the cloud computing space, and it is the buzzword du jour in computing right now. Who do I see being the eventual victors? Well, I see the people who are the best at it, or who are born to that world being the best at it. So the Amazons and Googles, I think, are the natural winners in that space. Microsoft, in a lot of ways, is playing catch up, but they've been counted out before, and they're surprisingly resilient in a lot of ways. And then we have lots of smaller companies like Twitter and Facebook. I saw something right around New Year's. Population, the world's most populous countries, and it was China, India, Facebook, United States. Facebook is kind of its own thing out there, and it has more members than the United States has population. It'll be interesting to see a few things, both what kind of social services networks people eventually get hooked up to. Will you be part of the Facebook, Apple, Amazon cloud, or Facebook, Apple cloud, or the Google Amazon cloud, or which one will you swear allegiance to and get most of your services from? Because these vertically integrated systems, like Apple's been giving us, has shown the world that a tightly vertically integrated system where I have my content, movies, music, books, things like that, my devices, my iPhone, my iPad, my laptop, all working together, synchronous with each other in one seamless experience. It's hard to leave that world, right? So you really are swearing allegiance to one brand, one vendor, or one ecosystem when you do that. So who do I see being the winners there? I think the guys who are born in those spaces, the Twitters, Facebooks, Googles, Amazons, are the guys who definitely have the upper hand because they're genetically predisposed to being excellent in that space. And the older school companies that came before them are maybe not so genetically predisposed to it. Although Apple is just Apple. I mean, they defy gravity, right? Yeah, I'm an Apple guy. Well, I mean, if you look at what they've done since, whatever, the last 12 years or so, how they've gone from bringing jobs back in-house to being what they are today. I mean, they posted, what was it, $6 billion in profit yesterday? $6 billion in profit for a quarter. That's pretty amazing.
So do you think we're in a reactive mode as far as security?
As far as security is concerned, are we in a reactive or proactive mode? Almost always, especially technologically, we are in a reactive mode. Because the threats redefine themselves. When it's an arms race, right? We have measure, countermeasure. And when new countermeasures are developed, new measures are developed to defeat them, circumvent them, operate in ways that they don't consider, and things like that. And one of the big problems that you have with security technologies is that a lot of times there are gaps between them. Functional gaps, visibility gaps between them. Look at firewalls and intrusion detection and prevention systems. The gaps that are between those technologies are really big, and if one fails to do its job and then the other fails to do its job, a lot of times there's nothing backing it up. So you look at functionality gaps and kind of scope gaps and things like that, and that's actually something the attackers really take advantage of as much as they can. Yep.
So let's take one more question and then we'll head to the reception.
Okay.
There's a lot of work underway in the area of standards for security by IEEE, ISO, et cetera. I wanted to ask, what's your view of that, and is enough being done?
Okay, so the question was, there are a lot of standards that are coming out from organizations like IEEE and ISO to help develop new regimes of security or new compliance control systems or even new methods of doing software engineering that are centered around security. What do I think of them? I think that generally speaking, they're good, but they're targeted at not necessarily the researchers. They're targeted at the big companies. They're targeted at the Adobes and Microsofts and Apples and Googles and things like that. And to some degree, if I am a technologist at a company whose job it is to develop innovative technology, which I am, I look at those things and I really have to think about what are the trade-offs that I'm going to be making. If I want to be a CMM level 5 shop, to develop intrusion detection systems. Well, if that's, I'm not building the space shuttle here. I'm building intrusion detection systems. I don't want to have that level of purview and review and all these other things over shipping a version of Snort. Because if we ship Snort that way, you're not going to get an update a quarter. You're going to get an update, a year maybe. And it's not going to be a big update either. So they require a level of discipline that's rarely seen in the industry, and they especially don't apply to, in most cases, to the very entrepreneurs that build the foundations that all the stuff gets built on. Look at Google, Larry and Sergey operating in a garage. Look at HP, 2 guys in a garage. Look at Sourcefire, 4 guys in my living room. Or look at the beginnings of Snort, which is a really fundamental technology these days, which was developed literally in a spare bedroom in my house when I was in my spare time. I wouldn't have paid any attention to those things, and I don't suspect any other guy who's learning on the job, right, learning how to build these systems as he builds them, and they happen to turn into the standard. That's just, it doesn't work that way. Even Vint Cerf, it was a research project. 32 bits ought to be enough for addressing. We'll just go with that. It's just a prototype. We just got to demo this thing working. We don't have to worry about it. We'll fix it later. So yeah, that happens a lot. So I think it's important for these bigger shots in a lot of ways, but I think it will fail to have the reach that maybe we need to get it to the guys with their hair on fire who have a new idea, who want to go make it work first, and then they'll worry about the implications of the design decisions they made later.
Roesch, thanks. It's been great. It's fantastic.
Thank you.